Story 1. The Knock That Came From Inside the Wall. Mireille Fontaine had lived alone in her apartment for 3 years before the knocking started. She was 31, a night shift nurse who slept during the day, and she had grown used to the odd sounds that old buildings make. The groan of pipes, the creak of floors settling, the distant argument that seeped through the ceiling like water through a crack. She had catalogued all of it. She had explanations for all of it. But she did not have an explanation for this. It started on a Tuesday in February, at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. She was lying in bed with the curtains drawn, hovering in that soft warm space just before sleep, when she heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, and coming not from the front door, not from a neighbor's wall, but from inside her bedroom wall. From within the plaster itself. She sat up. The apartment was silent. She waited. Nothing. She told herself it was the pipes. She laid back down. Then it happened again. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. Waiting. Ask yourself this. If you heard knocking from inside a wall in your home right now, what would you do? Would you knock back? Most people say they would. And that, according to those who have studied what lives in the spaces between walls, is the worst thing you can do. Mireille did not knock back. She was a practical woman. She called her building superintendent, a heavy-set man named Drago, who came up with a flashlight and a skeptical expression. He pressed his ear to the wall. He tapped along its surface with his knuckle. He told her it was probably air in the heating pipes and left without making eye contact. That night, Mireille woke at 2:47 again. The knocking was louder. And this time, there was something else. Between the knocks, she could hear a sound like breathing. Long, slow exhales that pulsed through the plaster like something pressing its mouth against the other side. She moved out of that bedroom. She slept on her couch for 2 weeks. The knocking followed her. 3 knocks. Always at 2:47. Always from the wall nearest to wherever she was sleeping. And always followed by that slow, patient breathing. It was her friend Ottavia who suggested they look up the building's history. What they found changed everything. In 1987, a tenant named Cedric Mallow had been reported missing from that exact unit. Police searched the apartment. They found nothing. They searched the building. They found nothing. The case went cold. Cedric Mallow was never found. The renovation records for the building, however, showed something curious. In February of 1988, the walls in Unit 4C were re-drywalled. Not because of water damage. Not because of wear. The records listed the reason simply as odor complaint. Mireille stopped sleeping in the apartment altogether after that. She stayed with Ottavia. But here is the thing that keeps this story alive in online forums and late-night conversations. When the next tenant moved into 4C, a young man named Philo Greer, he called the building management on his 3rd day there. He said he was hearing knocking from inside the wall. Story 2. The Girl in the Basement Photographs. In 2003, a family in rural Vermont purchased an old farmhouse at auction. The Van Thorpe family. A father, a mother, and their 2 children. They paid very little for it because the previous owners had left in a hurry and because no one else in the county was particularly interested in bidding. The first thing they found, beyond the crumbling porch and the smell of damp wood and something underneath the damp wood they could not name, was a box of photographs in the basement. Old photographs. Black and white. Dozens of them. They appeared to be pictures of the farmhouse itself, taken from various angles and at various times of day. Interesting, but not alarming. Old houses often held old memories. It was the daughter, 12-year-old Wren, who noticed it first. She was flipping through the photographs at the kitchen table, laying them out in a grid the way children do when they are trying to make sense of something. And she stopped. She held one photograph up close to her face. Then she held another. Then another. In every single photograph, in every one, there was a figure standing in the basement window. A small figure. A girl. Always in the same position. Arms at her sides. Face pressed to the glass. Looking out. The photographs were dated across 20 years. 1960 to 1980. The same girl. In every one. Unchanged. Think about that for a moment. 20 years of photographs. The same child. Never aging. Always at that window. What would you do if you developed photographs from your own house and found the same face in all of them? The Vanthorpes called a local historian, a woman named Drusilla Meck, who was familiar with the property. She told them what she knew, and what she knew was this. A girl had lived in that farmhouse in the early 1900s. She had been locked in the basement by her family during a winter when the roads were impassable and they could not get her to a doctor. She had died down there. The family had never spoken of it publicly. The basement window, Drusilla told them quietly, was the only source of light in that room. The Vanthorpes planned to leave. They had already made up their minds. But before they could, Wren's mother went into the basement to retrieve one last box. When she came back upstairs, she was pale and shaking and holding something in her hand. A photograph. One that had not been in the original box. One that appeared to be much newer, the edges still sharp, the paper still bright. It showed the kitchen table. The photographs spread across it in a grid. Wren bent over them. And standing behind Wren, arms at her sides, face close to the back of Wren's head, was the girl from the basement window. Story 3. The Voice in the Baby Monitor. This story comes from a parenting forum. The user went by the name Night Nurse _Vera and posted her experience in the small hours of a Wednesday morning. She said she was sharing it because she needed someone to tell her she was not losing her mind. By the time she finished writing, hundreds of people had responded. Most of them were not comforting. Vera and her husband had a 6-month-old son. They had a standard baby monitor, the kind with audio only, no video. She had set it up on the bookshelf beside her son's crib, pointed toward him so she could hear if he stirred. Standard. Sensible. Exactly what any careful parent would do. On the 4th night, she heard her son begin to fuss. She listened through the monitor, waiting to see if he would settle himself before she went in. He did not. But before she could get up, she heard something else through the monitor. A voice. Low and soft and very close to the microphone. And it said, "SHHHH. Go to sleep, little one." Vera was out of bed before she knew she was moving. She threw open her son's door. He was alone. He was asleep. The room was empty. She checked every inch of that room. Under the crib. The closet. The window, locked. Nothing. She sat beside him until morning with a flashlight in her hand, not sleeping, barely breathing, listening. The voice came back 3 more times over the following week. Always the same words. Always in the same low, gentle tone. SHHHH. Go to sleep, little one. And always, when she ran to the room, her son was alone and sleeping. What makes this story particularly disturbing is not the voice itself. It is what happened when Vera's husband, skeptical but trying to be supportive, took apart the baby monitor to check for interference. He found that the microphone had been set facing the wrong direction from the very first night. It was not pointed at the crib. It had been, the entire time, pointed at the corner of the room. The corner with nothing in it. The corner from which, as it turned out, the temperature readings in that room were always slightly colder than anywhere else, even in summer, even with the heat on. Vera switched to a video monitor. She never shared what she saw on it. She only said that they moved out of the house within the month, and that she still cannot hear the sound shhhh without her hands beginning to shake. Story 4. The Man Who Watched from the Road. There is a stretch of highway in northern Montana, a 2-lane road that runs through about 40 miles of nothing, scrubland and low hills, and the kind of sky that is so wide it makes you feel small in a way that is not comfortable. Locals call it the Long Blank. Truckers avoid it when they can. Not because of the road conditions. Because of the man. The sightings have been reported for at least 30 years. Different people, different vehicles, different times of day and night, but always the same description. A man standing on the side of the road. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothing that seems wrong for the season, too heavy in summer, too light in winter. He is always standing perfectly still. He is always facing the road. And he is always watching your vehicle as it passes, turning his head to follow it, even when you are moving at 70 miles an hour. The reason people report it to online forums and local police instead of simply assuming it is a hitchhiker is this. When you look in your rearview mirror after passing him, he is gone. Not walking away. Not walking toward anything. Simply gone. As if he was never there to begin with. Here is what makes your skin prickle. In 2019, a woman named Callaway Briggs was driving the Long Blank alone when she saw the man. She did what most people do. She sped up. She watched her rearview mirror. He vanished. She exhaled. She drove another 10 miles without incident. Then her car broke down. Engine failure, sudden and total, on a road where she had no cell service. She sat in her car for 40 minutes before she saw headlights approaching. Help, she thought. And then the headlights stopped about 50 yards behind her and did not move and did not get out of the car, and the lights stayed on for an hour before simply turning off, leaving her in complete darkness. She was found by a passing truck driver the next morning, still in her car, unable to speak clearly. She spent 3 days refusing to tell anyone what had happened during that hour of darkness. When she finally did, she said only one thing. He was already in the car when the lights went out. And he told me that the next time he would not leave. There has been no verified explanation for the man on the Long Blank. But the sightings continue. And interestingly, every reported sighting occurs within the same 2-mile stretch of the road, near a section where, in 1971, a vehicle carrying 4 people went off the road on a clear night with no explanation. No survivors. No cause ever determined. Story 5. The Photograph That Was Not There Yesterday. Soren Hack was a photographer, a professional one, who shot landscapes and sold prints to galleries and online collectors. He worked out of a home studio in a converted garage, and he kept meticulous records of every photograph he took, every file, every print. Organization was, he liked to say, the only thing standing between an artist and chaos. So when he sat down to review his work from the previous week and found a photograph in his catalog that he had not taken, he was more than unsettled. He was genuinely disturbed. Not because photographs do not appear by mistake. They sometimes do. Equipment glitches, accidental shutter releases, corrupt file transfers that pull in images from other sessions. He knew all of that. He had experienced all of that. What disturbed him was the photograph itself. It showed his studio, his desk, his equipment, everything in its precise place. The image was sharp and well-lit and taken with the skill of someone who knew what they were doing. And sitting at his desk, with his back to the camera and his head slightly tilted as if listening to something just out of frame, was a man. A man wearing Soren's own clothes. A man with Soren's own build, his own haircut, his own posture. But Soren had been alone all week. He had the security footage to prove it. He reviewed every hour of it. No one had entered the studio. The external door had not opened. Nothing on the footage explained the photograph. The timestamp on the file read 3:14 in the morning. The security footage for 3:14 showed the studio empty and still. His camera, which had taken the photograph according to the file data, was on the desk exactly where it always was, with the lens cap on. The detail that keeps this story circulating in photography forums and paranormal communities is this. Soren compared the photograph to his own reflection to see how closely the figure resembled him. And he noticed that the figure at his desk had its hands placed differently than he ever places his hands. They were flat on the desk, palms down, fingers slightly spread, as if holding something down, as if keeping something from rising. He deleted the photograph. He replaced his camera. He kept all of this to himself for almost 2 years before posting about it on a photography community forum. What brought it out of him was a reply to another user's unrelated post, someone talking about a strange image they had found in their catalog. A stranger, in a different country, in a different kind of studio, with the same timestamp. The same 3:14 in the morning. And the same posture. Palms flat. Fingers spread. Keeping something down. Story 6. The Town That Went Quiet. In 1952, a small town in rural Alaska, population around 300 people, stopped responding to all outside communication. Radio signals went unanswered. Mail was returned unopened. A supply plane that attempted to land reported that the landing strip was blocked with vehicles arranged in a deliberate pattern and that no one came out to meet them. The investigation that followed found the town intact. Buildings undamaged. Food on tables in some homes, frozen solid now but suggesting meals interrupted mid-preparation. Personal belongings in place. Animals in their pens, dead from starvation but otherwise unharmed. And not a single person. 300 people gone. The official explanation at the time cited a combination of severe weather and mass evacuation, though no evacuation had been ordered and no destination was ever identified. The case was classified, declassified in the 1990s, and promptly ignored by most media because by then there was nothing actionable to report and no surviving family members pursuing answers. But the details that remain in the declassified documents tell a different story. Or rather, they raise questions that the documents themselves do not answer. The arrangement of the vehicles on the landing strip was not random. An analyst noted that it matched, almost exactly, a pattern associated with certain indigenous protective rituals, the kind used to keep something out rather than to stop something from getting in. And on the wall of the town's community hall, scratched into the wood with what appeared to be fingernails, was a single sentence repeated over and over in at least 40 different handwriting styles. We heard it and we ran, but it was already behind us. What is the it that a town of 300 people ran from? What could make every man, woman, and child leave everything behind in the middle of meals, in the middle of sentences, in the middle of their lives? No one has ever answered that. The town no longer exists on any public map. The land is listed as federal wilderness. But people who have gone looking for it, drawn by the declassified documents, report something consistent and strange. At a certain point on the approach to where the town should be, their equipment stops working. Every time. Not fails. Stops. As if something is listening and does not want to be found. Story 7. The Room at the End of the Hall. Petra Ulanova checked into the Belmore Hotel in November of last year as part of a work conference. She was given room 312, a standard room on the 3rd floor, nothing unusual in its description or its listing. She found it without trouble, swiped her key card, and entered. The room was fine. Clean, adequately heated, the curtains a forgettable shade of beige. She set down her bag. She hung up her coat. And then she noticed the door. At the end of a short hallway connecting the bathroom to the main room, there was a door she had not expected. Not the bathroom door, not the closet, but a third door. Plain wood, no handle on her side, a small gap at the bottom through which she could feel cool air moving. She assumed it connected to the adjacent room, a standard feature in some hotels for connected suites. She thought nothing of it. She thought nothing of it until 2 in the morning when she woke to the sound of footsteps on the other side of that door. Slow, measured footsteps, as if someone were pacing. Back and forth. Patient. Deliberate. She called the front desk. They told her, after a pause that went on slightly too long, that there was no adjacent room. That door, they said, did not connect to anything. It was original to the building, from a 1960s renovation, and it had been sealed from the other side for decades. Petra asked what was on the other side of it. Another pause. The voice on the phone, carefully neutral, said she should try to get some sleep and that they would send someone up in the morning to address any concerns. The footsteps continued until 4:37 and then stopped. Petra did not sleep. In the morning, she asked a maintenance worker directly. He looked at her room number and then looked at her and then, quietly, told her that she was not the first person in that room to report the footsteps. That every few months, someone called about them. And that the last time they had opened that door to check what was on the other side, the maintenance worker who had volunteered to go in had come back out in 45 seconds and had quit his job before the end of the shift. What did he see? The maintenance worker refused to say. He refused to speak about it at all. He moved to another city. He left no forwarding address. The door in room 312 remains sealed. Guests are still placed in that room. The footsteps continue. Story 8. The Laughing in the Trees. The campsite at Dulro Lake has been used by hikers and campers for generations. A beautiful spot by any reasonable measure. Dense pine forest around the edge of a small clear lake, a good trail system, reliable if basic facilities. The Park Service maintains it well. Families go there. School groups go there. It has the kind of reputation that draws people back year after year. But there is a radius. Experienced hikers talk about it. A circle of roughly 200 meters in the trees to the north of the main campsite, beyond the marked trails and just past the second ridge, where something is wrong. Not wrong in a way you can point to immediately. Wrong in the way a room feels wrong when something has been moved and you cannot identify what. Wrong in the way a smile feels wrong when it does not reach the eyes. Within that radius, sounds behave differently. Your own footsteps seem too loud, then too soft. The birds stop. The wind drops. And then, if you stop walking and stay very still, you hear it. Laughing. Children laughing. Light and distant and echoing strangely, as if it is coming from multiple directions at once, as if the trees are full of children who are laughing at something you cannot see. The first documented report of this came from a forest ranger in 1978 who wrote it in his logbook with visible embarrassment, surrounding it with disclaimers about wind acoustics and the way sound carries over water. The most recent report came from a hiking group of 8 adults who all heard it simultaneously and who all, independently of each other when interviewed afterward, used the same word to describe it. Wrong. The laughing was wrong. The theory that has gained the most traction, though it is purely speculation, concerns a photograph found in the Park Service archives from the early 1900s. It shows a group of children standing at the edge of the tree line in what appears to be the exact area described. They are posed formally, hands at their sides. They are not smiling. But one child at the far left of the photograph has her head turned away from the camera, turned toward the trees, at something that was not caught in the frame. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that has faded to near invisibility, someone has written, "They did not come back from the trees." If you are camping alone tonight, or even in a group, ask yourself this. If you heard children laughing just beyond the edge of where you could see, would you go toward the sound or away from it? Most people say toward it. Most people think they are the kind of person who would go toward it. People always overestimate their bravery before the moment arrives. Story 9. The Letters from Nowhere. Imara Djokovic began receiving letters in September. They came in plain white envelopes with no return address and her name and address written in a handwriting she did not recognize. The first letter said only this: "I have been watching you since you moved in and you are more interesting than the last one." She assumed it was a neighbor being strange. She threw it away. The second letter came the following week. It contained a detailed description of her morning routine. The time she woke, what she ate, the route she walked to the bus stop, the way she paused at the corner with the large oak tree and looked up at the branches. She went to the police. They took a report and told her to save the letters. The third letter arrived before the police had done anything at all. It described a conversation she had privately in her apartment, a phone call with her sister, word for word. Imara tore her apartment apart. She found no hidden devices. She had the apartment swept professionally. Nothing. The letters kept coming, once a week, every week, describing private moments, private conversations, private thoughts she had spoken aloud to no one. It described a nightmare she had had. It described a memory she had not thought about in years, as if something had looked into her mind and read it the way you read a book. The letters stopped in December. Suddenly, completely, with no explanation. The last letter said only, "I have learned what I needed. Thank you for your patience." The police never identified a sender. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The letters had been handled by too many people for fingerprint analysis to be useful. No surveillance footage from her building or street showed anyone placing letters in her mailbox on the days they arrived. They appeared in her box. Full stop. With no visible origin. Imara moved. New city, new apartment. No forwarding address given to anyone except her immediate family. For 5 months. Nothing. Then in May of this year, a plain white envelope in her new mailbox, in the same handwriting, with her new address. The letter inside said, "I told you I found you interesting." Story 10. The Inheritance. When Donatello Marsh's grandmother died, she left him the family house in her will, which was unusual because she had not spoken to him or anyone in the family in 11 years. The estrangement had no clear origin. She had simply one day stopped responding to calls and letters and had refused to open the door when they came to visit. They had assumed she was managing something private. They had given her space. 11 years of space. When Donatello entered the house for the first time since childhood, he understood immediately why she had not wanted them to visit. Every window in the house was covered, not with curtains, but with newspapers. Layer after layer of them, some going back decades. Every mirror had been turned to face the wall. Every clock had been stopped at the same time, 2:47. And every room, every single room, had something written on the floor in chalk, concentric circles with words inside them that he could not read because they were in a language he did not recognize. The upstairs was worse. His grandmother's bedroom had the door nailed shut from the inside. When he finally got it open, he found the room bare except for a chair placed exactly in the center and a journal on the seat. The journal was his grandmother's handwriting, 30 years of entries that started normally, grocery lists and family observations and the mild complaints of an older woman, and then shifted, around page 200, into something fragmented and urgent. She wrote about something she called the visitor, something that had come into her house. Something she had first assumed was a person but had gradually understood was not. She wrote about what the visitor wanted. She wrote that it wanted to be seen, that it fed on being observed, that every time she looked at it directly, it grew stronger and she grew weaker. The mirrors turned to the wall, she wrote, were so she would not accidentally see it over her shoulder. The newspapers on the windows were so she could not catch its reflection in the glass. The chalk circles, she wrote, were the only thing keeping it contained to the upstairs. The final journal entry was dated 3 days before her death. It said simply, It has started sitting with me at night, and I have started to find it comforting, and I know that means I have already lost. Donatello sold the house without telling any of this to the buyers. He told himself they would be fine. He told himself it was superstition. He told himself a lot of things. But he kept the journal. And sometimes, when he opens it to reread those final entries, he notices that the handwriting in the last few pages looks slightly different. Still his grandmother's hand, but with more confidence, more ease, as if whoever wrote those last words was not frightened at all. Story 11. The Neighbors Who Moved at Night. There is something universally unsettling about moving trucks in the dark. Lena Vasquez, who wrote about her experience extensively on a True Encounters community page, said she noticed the truck at 2 a.m, headlights off, engine barely audible, pulling up to the house across the street which had been empty for 8 months. She watched from her bedroom window as figures moved boxes from the truck into the house. Quickly, silently, in the dark. She told herself the new tenants were simply unusual. Maybe they worked nights. Maybe they preferred to move without neighbors watching. Fine. She went back to sleep. The next morning, the truck was gone. The house appeared occupied but showed no signs of life. No lights. No cars in the driveway. No sound. She did not see anyone come or go. This continued for 3 weeks. Lena, curious and slightly concerned, began keeping a written log. She filled 6 pages before she noticed the pattern. The house showed signs of activity exclusively between midnight and 4 a.m. During daylight hours, it was silent and still. During business hours, no deliveries arrived. No mail was collected. No one entered or exited. On a Saturday night, she saw one of them clearly for the first time. A figure at the window, looking out, at her house, perfectly still. For 45 minutes without moving. She filed a welfare check request with local police. Officers visited the house. They knocked. A man answered the door. He was cooperative, they told her. He said his family had just moved in and were still adjusting to the neighborhood. He seemed normal. They left. But Lena noticed something in the brief moment. The door was open wide enough to see past the man. The inside of the house was still completely empty. No furniture. No boxes. Just the man at the door, and behind him, the interior of an empty house. And in the empty house, standing at various distances back from the door, 4 or 5 other figures in the dark, standing still, facing toward the door, watching the officers on the porch with a stillness and attention that, she said, was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. Not threatening. Not moving. Just watching. With the focused patience of things that are very good at waiting. The family was gone within a month. Gone as they came. Overnight. Without noise. The house was listed for sale by a management company that could not provide the names of the previous tenants when asked. Story 12. The Recording. This one begins with a sound file. That is how it started circulating online, as a sound file that someone posted to a forum for audio engineers and sound designers, asking for help identifying the source of certain elements in the recording. The post was made by a user called Torvald_audio, who said he had found the file on a tape recorder he bought at an estate sale. The recording was 12 minutes long. Most of it was static, the kind of thick, layered static you get from old magnetic tape. But underneath the static, just barely audible, was a voice. Torvald had done basic cleanup work on the audio, reducing the static, amplifying the quieter frequencies, and what emerged was a man speaking. He was reading something. A list. Except the list was not of objects or tasks. It was of names. Hundreds of names. Read in a flat, even voice with no emotion and no pause between them. The forum members who responded did their own analysis. They confirmed the voice was real, not synthesized, not layered from multiple sources. One user who enhanced the audio further found something the original poster had missed. Beneath the voice reading the names, at a frequency so low it was almost below human hearing, was a second voice, also reading a list. But the second list was not names. It was addresses. Someone checked some of the addresses. Some of them existed. Some matched locations associated with disappearances or unexplained deaths. Not all. Not even most. But enough that the thread was flagged and removed by the forum moderators within 48 hours. Torvald was contacted privately by several users who said they recognized specific names from the list. Names of people who had vanished without explanation. They asked where he had bought the tape recorder. He said it was from an estate sale in rural Minnesota, the belongings of a man who had died alone in his house after having lived there for 40 years without close neighbors or known family. The tape recorder was a commercial model discontinued in 1983. It could not have been manufactured after that year. Which means the recording was made before 1983. Which means the addresses on that list, the addresses connected to disappearances and unexplained deaths, were recorded before those events occurred. Torvald removed all his posts about the recording. His account was deleted. The sound file has been uploaded and removed many times since. No one has been able to verify its current location. But people who claim to have heard the full 12 minutes say there is something that Torvald never mentioned in his posts. At the very end of the recording, just as the static rises again to swallow everything, the voice reading the names pauses for the first time. And then it reads one final name. And then it says, soon. Story 13. The Sleepwalker's Map. Nadia Osman's husband began sleepwalking in his 30s, which doctors told them was unusual but not cause for alarm. People developed parasomnias at all ages. It was stress, probably. It was disrupted sleep cycles. It was manageable. They gave him mild medication. It helped somewhat. He still walked, but less frequently, and he was easy to guide back to bed. What no one told them to watch for was the drawing. One morning, Nadia woke to find her husband already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, looking at something in his hands. He did not remember getting up. He did not remember going to the kitchen. He was holding a piece of paper on which he had drawn, in remarkable detail, a floor plan. A house. Large, complex, many rooms, a peculiar architecture that felt wrong in a way she could not immediately articulate, hallways that led into each other, rooms without doors, a staircase that appeared to descend twice from the same landing. This happened again the following week. And the week after. Always a different drawing. Always some architectural plan or map or layout. Always drawn with a precision her husband, who was an accountant with no architectural training, could not replicate when he was awake. Nadia began photographing the drawings and posting them to an architecture forum, curious about what they represented. Most forum members identified them as nonsensical, impossible structures that violated basic physical principles. But one user, a retired structural engineer named August Weld, went quiet for 2 days after seeing the drawings and then sent Nadia a private message that she has shared only with close friends. He said the maps were consistent. Not random. Despite being drawn over many weeks, they were all parts of the same structure. He had been piecing them together. And what he had assembled so far was the interior layout of a building he recognized. Not because he had ever been in it, but because he had spent years researching a specific location connected to a series of unexplained events in the 1960s, a location that had been demolished and whose records were largely unavailable. He asked how her husband was sleeping. He asked if her husband had ever been to this location. He asked, very gently, if her husband ever said anything in his sleep. Nadia said yes. He did say something sometimes. Always the same thing. Always in a flat, sleeping voice with his eyes half open. He said, "I know the way back. I know the way back. I know the way back. Back from where? They have never found out. The drawings continue. The structure in them grows more complete with every week. August Weld says they are close to having the full map. He will not say what he thinks is at the center of the building. He says he wants to be wrong. Story 14. The Child at the Crossroads. Truck drivers have their own network of shared experience, a culture of stories told at rest stops and over CB radio in the dark hours of the night, when the highway stretches empty and the headlights push at a darkness that feels deliberately uncooperative. Among certain routes, certain stretches of certain roads, there are stories that are told with the seriousness of navigational warnings. Here, the fog does not lift. There, your radio will cut out at the same place every time. And on the stretch of Route 9 between Harkins Mill and the Tresco County line, you do not stop for children at the crossroads. The Child has been reported by at least 40 different truck drivers across 15 years. A young boy, roughly 8 years old, standing alone at the intersection of Route 9 and what the maps call Forest Road 14, though very little forest remains near it now. He is always alone. Always at night. Always standing in the middle of the road, not on the shoulder but in the actual lane. He does not move when headlights find him. He does not flinch. Most drivers slow, instinctively, some kind of human alarm firing in the chest at the sight of a child in a dark road at 3 in the morning. Some stop. The ones who have stopped describe the same thing. The boy approaches the passenger window. He asks to get in. He says he needs to get home. He says his house is not far. Every driver who has let him in the vehicle says the same thing happens next. They drive with him. They ask where his house is. He gives directions. The directions always lead to the same place, an abandoned property 6 miles down Forest Road 14 that has been empty since the 1970s. When they arrive, the boy looks at the property and says, "This is wrong. It used to be different. Can you take me further?" No one has ever agreed to take him further. The drivers who have been that far all report that when they refuse and look at the boy in the passenger seat, there is a quality to his stillness that overrides every other instinct and sends them accelerating back to the main road without explanation, as if something in a very old part of the brain has understood what the logical mind has not yet caught up to. One driver, a woman named Corvina Mills, reported a small additional detail that no other driver mentioned. She said that when the boy looked at the abandoned house, she saw his reflection in the passenger window. And the reflection was not facing the house. It was facing her. And it was smiling. Story 15. The Sounds from Below. The residents of the Ashworth apartment complex in central Ohio began reporting sounds in early spring of the year before last. Sounds from below. A thumping, rhythmic, emanating from the sub-basement, which was listed in the building schematics as a utility space used for water heaters and electrical infrastructure. No one, management said, worked down there except for quarterly maintenance visits. The sounds were not maintenance sounds. They were too regular, too deliberate, too consistent across all hours of the day and night. Residents on the ground floor heard them clearly. Those on the second floor heard them during quiet periods. By April, a group of 12 tenants had formally complained to management, who sent a maintenance team to investigate. The team found nothing unusual. Water heaters running normally. Electrical systems within expected parameters. No evidence of pest infestation. No evidence of unauthorized access. They wrote in their report that they had not heard any anomalous sounds during their inspection, though they noted that the sub-basement was unusually warm for the season and that the center of the room, for no reason they could identify, was significantly warmer than the edges. A warm spot in a room with no apparent heat source. Ask yourself what could create that. In May, a resident named Thaddeus Reyes, a mechanical engineer with a calm and methodical approach to problems, set up his own recording equipment in his ground-floor apartment, pointed toward the floor, and ran it continuously for 72 hours. What he captured was later analyzed by two independent audio engineers. The sounds from below were rhythmic. They matched a pattern approximately consistent with breathing. Long, slow, deep inhalations and exhalations, at a rate much slower than a human resting breath, perhaps one full cycle every 25 seconds. But the thing that the audio engineers found most notable, the thing that made one of them send Thaddeus a follow-up email marked with unusual urgency, was the size of the source. Based on the frequency and resonance characteristics of the sound, the engineer estimated that whatever was producing a sound of that volume and depth from a subbasement would need to be, at minimum, very large. The exact word he used in the email was vast. The complex was condemned in July of that year for an unrelated structural issue. The subbasement was sealed. The building file was transferred to a county archive. Thaddeus submitted his recordings to 3 paranormal research groups and 1 university acoustic department. He received responses from all of them. He has not shared what those responses said. Story 16. The Antique Shop at the End of Morrow Street. Every city of a certain age has a place like this. The shop that has been there longer than anyone can remember, that appears on old photographs in unexpected corners of the background, that never seems to be closed but never quite appears to be busy either. In the city in question, the city being deliberately unnamed because the people who know it will recognize it without being told, the shop is on Morrow Street. At the end of it, where the road narrows and the streetlights are spaced just slightly too far apart. The owner of the shop has been described by everyone who has entered it in the last 30 years in ways that create a singular and disturbing consistency. Very tall, very thin, very old, though in an indeterminate way, the way that makes you feel the oldness before you can measure it in features. He gives his name as simply Mr. Cross. Not a first name, not a last name, simply Mr. Cross. The shop sells what antique shops sell: furniture, clocks, books, mirrors, small objects of uncertain origin. People have bought things from the shop and come back later to complain, not about quality, not about authenticity, but about behavior. Things that move when no one is looking. Books that open to different pages than where they were closed. Mirrors that occasionally show the room from a slightly different angle than the physics of reflection should allow. A researcher who visited the shop in 2018 as part of a project on unusual retail establishments recorded his interaction with Mr. Cross and shared the transcript online. Mr. Cross, when asked how long he had been in business, paused for a very long time before answering. He said, "Longer than the street." When asked what he meant by that, he said, "I was here before the street was here. I will be here after it is gone." The researcher asked about the unusual reports from customers. Mr. Cross smiled, which the researcher described in his notes as a smile with too many stages to it, and said, "The objects remember where they came from. Sometimes they try to go back." The researcher asked where they came from. Mr. Cross looked at him with an attention that the researcher said made him feel like something being measured, and said, "The same place everything comes from. The place before." The shop appears to still be open. People who have gone looking for it recently have reported finding it easily, but finding, once they get close to it, that they have no memory of what they intended to buy, and leave empty-handed with a feeling they cannot name that stays with them for several days. Story 17. The Figure in the Water. Lake Corna sits in the mountains of a region that prefers not to be identified by its tourism board in connection with the things people say about it. It is a beautiful lake, still and clear, with a quality of glass in the early morning, reflecting the mountains and sky with a fidelity that makes it difficult to tell where the real landscape ends and the reflection begins. Hikers visit it regularly. Photographers love it. Swimmers come in summer. Swimmers, however, are officially discouraged now, after what happened to a group of 4 friends in the summer of 3 years ago. They had hiked up to the lake in the afternoon and stayed longer than intended, watching the sun go down behind the mountains, and then decided to swim in the warm evening air because the water, as it always is at that altitude, was cold enough to be exhilarating rather than comfortable. They were in the water for perhaps 20 minutes when one of them, a young woman named Ilka, reached down toward what she thought was a rock on the lake floor to push off from it. The rock moved. It was not a rock. It was a hand. She felt it close around her ankle. She screamed. She got out. Everyone got out. They all looked back at the water. The surface of the lake was completely still. No disturbance. No bubbles. No sign of anything beneath. But standing in the water, visible from the knees up, in the exact spot where Ilka had been, was a figure. Standing still. In water that, at that point in the lake, was deep enough that a standing figure's head would have to be 10 feet underwater. The figure was standing upright. It was looking at them, and its arms were at its sides except for one hand, which was extended in a direction that was not quite toward them and not quite away, pointing at something they could not identify, with the patient precision of something that has been waiting a very long time to show someone. They reported this to park authorities. A dive team went into the lake 2 days later. They found, at the location Ilka described, a formation of rock on the lake floor. The rock formation was not natural. It was arranged. And in the center of the arrangement was an object that the dive team photographed and removed and has since declined to discuss publicly, citing an active investigation that has now been ongoing for 3 years with no public update. Ilka has said in interviews that she still dreams about the hand. Not about being grabbed. Just about the hand. The way the fingers closed. Not with urgency. With familiarity. As if it already knew her. Story 18. The House That Grows. This is a story about a house that should not be possible, and yet the measurements confirm it. A house that gets larger on the inside than it is on the outside. Not a story about hidden rooms, though hidden rooms are part of it. Not a story about optical illusions, though some have tried to explain it that way. A story about a house in which the interior dimensions simply do not match the exterior dimensions, and the discrepancy grows over time. The house was built in 1924 in a mid-sized city in the American South. It is a 3-bedroom, 2-story structure with a footprint that has never changed visibly from the outside. But successive owners, beginning in the 1960s, have commissioned surveys and found things that should not be there. A hallway that extends 2 feet further than the exterior wall should allow. A basement that is several feet deeper than the foundation depth that the original construction records indicate. A room on the second floor that is, according to careful measurement, 8 feet wide from the inside, but that, when measured from the exterior, is directly sandwiched between 2 rooms that together account for all the available width, leaving no physical space for the room at all. The most recent owner, a woman named Yold Crane, who purchased the house 3 years ago and has been meticulously documenting it, has found 12 spaces that should not exist. She has mapped them. She posts her measurements and photographs regularly to a community of people who follow her project. The community has grown significantly because people find what she is doing simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling. Last month, Yold found something new. A door she had not seen before, in a section of the basement she had surveyed multiple times. It was there. Then it was not there. Then it was there again. She has now documented it appearing and disappearing 17 times over 3 weeks. She has not opened it. Her community has been urging her to open it and urging her not to open it in roughly equal measure. She has said that she is waiting because she wants to be sure of what she is dealing with before she makes a decision she cannot reverse. What she said in her most recent post is what has kept the community breathless. She said she has realized that the spaces that should not exist are increasing in number. Something inside the house is growing. Something inside the house is making more room for itself. And she is not yet sure whether the thing that needs more room is a thing that has always been there or a thing that is still arriving. Story 19. The Fog of Harlow Crossing. 3 miles outside a small town that most road maps do not include because it was officially depopulated in the 1990s, there is an intersection locals still call Harlow Crossing. It marks the place where two old county roads meet at a right angle, surrounded by flat farmland on all sides, no buildings in view, no shelter, nothing remarkable in any direction. On clear days, you can see for miles. On foggy days, which happen frequently in this low-lying area, the visibility drops to almost nothing and the roads disappear in both directions. The stories about Harlow Crossing all involve the fog. Specifically, they involve what people have seen in the fog. People who have been stranded there, or who have stopped for whatever reason, describe seeing shapes. Not vague shapes, not the kind of shapes that fog always produces when you are frightened and your mind is searching for pattern. Specific shapes. Figures. Walking in the fog at a pace that seems wrong, either too slow to be purposeful or slightly too fast to be comfortable. Never approaching directly. Always visible just at the edge of the fog, just at the threshold of where you can see, as if they are aware of exactly where the boundary of visibility is. A pair of journalists visited Harlow Crossing in 2022 and spent 3 foggy nights there with recording equipment. On the second night, both of them, independently and simultaneously, stopped speaking mid-conversation and sat completely still for approximately 4 minutes. When they came back to themselves, they could not account for the silence. They had not felt it pass. They reviewed their audio recording and found that during those 4 minutes, the ambient sound of the fog, the subtle white noise of moisture and air, had simply stopped. Complete silence. For 4 minutes. And then the ambient sound returned, and they resumed their conversation as if nothing had happened. They published their findings. The audio file was reviewed and confirmed. What no one has been able to explain is what they captured in the recording at the 1-minute mark of the 4 minutes of silence. A sound. Brief. Low. Coming from very close to the microphone. Not a natural sound. Not an equipment sound. A sound like a very long, very slow exhalation. One breath. From something standing directly beside the recording equipment in the fog. And standing, it must be noted, in a location where, when the journalists played back the recording and stood in that same spot, there was nothing around them for 30 meters in every direction. Story 20. The Other Side of the Mirror. Remy Halvorsen had a large mirror in his hallway. An antique, picked up at a market, with an ornate dark frame and glass that had the slight warp of age in it, the way old mirrors catch light from different angles and hold it differently than modern glass does. He liked it. It suited the apartment. He thought nothing of it for the first 6 months of owning it. Then he noticed that his reflection was off. Not dramatically. Not in a way that made him call anyone immediately. In a way that made him stand in front of the mirror for a long moment with his head tilted, trying to identify what was wrong, before shaking it off as tiredness or bad lighting. His reflection seemed to move a fraction of a second after he did. Not enough to be certain. Just enough to feel wrong. He started testing it. Small movements. Quick ones. He would raise his hand suddenly and watch his reflection's hand to see if there was a lag. Some days there was nothing, and he felt foolish. Other days the lag was unmistakable, a quarter second, a half second. His reflection catching up to him with an expression that was not quite the expression he had made. He covered the mirror. He told himself he was under too much stress. He left it covered for 2 weeks. When he uncovered it, his reflection was doing something he was not doing. Standing still, which he was, but with one hand slightly raised. A gesture he had not made. A position he was not in. He called his brother, Bram, who came over and stood in front of the mirror with him. Bram's reflection was normal. Perfectly synchronized. Nothing wrong. He looked at Remy's reflection and said, "Your reflection looks fine too." And Remy looked at his reflection, which was now perfectly synchronized, and thought, "Yes, of course it does. Of course it looks fine now. He sold the mirror to a second-hand shop. 3 months later, a stranger contacted him through the shop's records after buying the mirror from them, asking if he had noticed anything unusual about it, because his wife had stopped sleeping and was spending hours standing in front of the mirror at night, and when he came downstairs to bring her back to bed, he said she did not turn around immediately. She stood for another moment and watched the mirror with an expression he could not read, and then the expression cleared and she turned around and smiled and came back to bed. He asked Remy what he thought was in the mirror. Remy did not know what to say. So he said what he had been thinking for 3 months, what he had not said to Bram or anyone. He said, "I think what is in the mirror is something that wears faces. And I think it is very patient. And I think it is learning." Story 21. The Library Book. There is nothing unusual about finding a note inside a library book. People leave bookmarks, receipts, folded papers, handwritten passages they wanted to remember. It happens constantly. Librarians find them and throw them away or set them aside, unremarkable detritus of reading life. The note that Fatou Mwangi found inside a copy of a botanical field guide was, at first, exactly this kind of unremarkable thing. It was a handwritten note on yellowed paper. It said, "If you are reading this, you have already been inside the place for longer than you know. Look at the clock. You will find more time has passed than you thought. Don't worry. Everyone loses time there. The important thing is not to go back after dark." Fatou checked the clock on her phone. She had been in the library for, she was certain, about 30 minutes. Her phone told her she had been there for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She showed the note to the librarian, who looked at it briefly and said she had found notes like that in books before, left by students playing pranks. But the librarian kept the note in her hand a moment too long, and when she handed it back she looked at Fatou with an expression that was not dismissive. It was careful. The expression of someone choosing their words. The librarian said the note was probably old. She said the book had been in the collection for a long time. She said Fatou should not worry about it. Then she looked around the library as though checking something, leaned slightly forward, and said in a quieter voice, "She usually suggests people finish their business here before 4 o'clock. A lot of people have mentioned the time thing. She's never been able to explain it. She just prefers that the building is empty by 4. Fatou asked why. The librarian straightened up and went back to her desk and began sorting books with the focused energy of someone ending a conversation. Fatou left the library. She came back the next day, before 4, and found the same copy of the Botanical Field Guide on the shelf where she had left it. She opened it. The note was gone. In its place was a different note, in different handwriting, on fresh paper. This note said only, "Don't come back tomorrow." She came back the next day. She has not spoken publicly about what happened after that. She has only said that she thinks certain buildings are like certain people. They have things inside them they would rather keep private. And sometimes, when you look for those things look back. Story 22. The Animals of Wickfield Road. In the spring of 2 years ago, something began happening to the animals in the neighborhood surrounding Wickfield Road in a county that is asked to remain unnamed. It began with dogs. Specifically, dogs refusing to go outside after dark. Dogs that had previously been perfectly comfortable with nighttime walks. Dogs that had shown no history of anxiety, suddenly refusing outright at a specific hour, 8:30 in the evening, to step past the front door. Pulling back on their leashes. Flattening to the ground. Whining with a sustained, low, almost toneless sound that their owners found deeply uncomfortable in a way they struggled to articulate. Then cats began disappearing from outdoor spaces. Not through predation, no signs of struggle, not through escape, collars and microchips never triggering. Just gone. And then coming back, some of them, days later, thin and unchanged except for a quality in their behavior that their owners described uniformly as distanced, as if the cat was running a performance of itself rather than being itself. The birds were the last indicator. By midsummer, the birds on Wickfield Road had gone. Not migrated, it was the wrong season. Not died, no bodies. Simply not present. Silent trees. Feeders untouched. The kind of absence that is loud because you only notice it when it's gone. A wildlife biologist named Casimir Elrott began investigating after multiple residents contacted the local nature conservancy. His report, which he shared with the conservancy and which has since been shared informally in wildlife and paranormal crossover communities, noted something specific. All of the animal behavior changes centered on an area roughly 400 meters in diameter, centered on an undeveloped lot on Wickfield Road that had been the site of a demolished building. The foundation was still visible. Grass had not grown back over it in the 3 years since demolition. Elrott noted in his report that the grass around the foundation, the birds, the nocturnal behavior of dogs, were all consistent with an environmental response to something. Animals, he wrote, do not perform anxiety. They respond to stimuli. Something in that 400-meter radius is producing a stimulus to which the local fauna are responding with avoidance behaviors. Identifying the stimulus is beyond the scope of this survey. He included one personal note at the end of the report, outside the formal language of the rest of the document. He wrote, "I spent 40 minutes on the site on a Tuesday evening. I left when I realized that in 40 minutes I had not had a single thought. Not one. My mind was completely empty. I have been a scientist for 22 years. I have never experienced anything like it. I recommend against extended time on site without significant further study." Story 23. The Twin Who Came Back. This is a story about a woman named Bronte Halloway and her twin sister Maris, who died in a car accident when both women were 29. Bronte survived. Maris did not. The grief was, as it always is in these cases, of a particular and devastating depth, the loss not only of a person but of the one human being who had shared her beginning. Bronte moved through the stages of that grief in the way people do. Slowly. Incompletely. She kept Maris's phone number in her contacts for 2 years before she deleted it. She kept Maris's coat in her closet for longer than that. She talked to Maris in the car, in the shower, in the quiet of the evenings when the world seemed very large and she seemed very small in it. This is normal. People do this. It is a form of continuation. What is not normal is what happened 8 months after Maris died. Bronte received a text from Maris's number. She had not yet deleted it at this point. The text said, "I'm outside. Can you let me in?" Bronte assumed it was a mistake, a reassigned number, someone reaching the wrong contact. She replied, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "It's me. You know it's me. Please let me in. It's cold." Bronte went to her window. There was no one outside. She called the number. It rang several times, and then a recorded voice told her the number was no longer in service. She texted again. The reply came, "Don't call. Just come to the door." She did not go to the door. She sat very still for a very long time. Then she texted, "Maris is gone. Please stop." The final message came 4 minutes later. It said, "I know. But something came back in her place. And it's been outside for a long time now. And it's starting to get impatient." The texts have never been explained. The phone company confirmed that the number had been deactivated within a week of Maris's death. There is no technical mechanism by which an inactive number can send or receive messages. Bronte reported this to several people and has been consistent in her account across multiple tellings. She has said that the thing that frightens her most is not the content of the messages. It is the specific phrase. Something came back. Not Maris came back. Something as if whatever sent those messages was not claiming to be Maris, was claiming to be something else that had found Maris's absence and filled it. Story 24. The Night Shift at the Museum. Security work in a museum at night is, by most accounts, intensely boring. Long hours, quiet corridors, the same patrol routes repeated until the patterns are automatic. Orrin Vance had worked night security at a natural history museum for 2 years before anything happened that he could not explain. He was, by his own description, the last person inclined toward imagination about his workplace. He had catalogued every ambient sound, every trick of light, every way that shadows moved in the glow of the emergency lighting. He was thorough and rational and not the kind of man who startled easily. He was doing his 3 o'clock patrol of the large mammal wing when he saw the exhibit had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone else would have noticed. One of the taxidermied wolves in the frozen hunt diorama was facing a different direction than it normally faced. It had been facing left, part of the pack arrangement, and now it was facing directly toward the corridor. Toward him. He assumed it had been shifted during the day, a maintenance adjustment, cleaning, something. He made a note in his log and continued his patrol. On his next pass at 4 o'clock, the wolf was back in its original position. Facing left. Part of the pack. On his 5 o'clock pass, 2 wolves were facing the corridor. At this point, Orrin stopped in the middle of the corridor and looked at the diorama for a long moment. He looked at the specific quality of stillness in the mounted animals, the glass eyes and the preserved fur and the eternal mid-step poses. He thought about the fact that taxidermied animals are, by definition, inhabited only by their own remains. Fur and bone and form. Nothing living. He was thinking all of this when he noticed that the large bear in the center of the diorama, which he had passed 100 times on 100 patrols, was positioned with one paw slightly raised. He was almost certain it had not been like that before. He was almost certain, looking at it, that the paw had been flat on the ground. He checked the archive photographs from the exhibit's installation in the morning. The bear's paw had always been flat on the ground. He submitted a maintenance request about the wolf positioning and did not mention the bear in the request because he did not know how to write what he was thinking. He left the museum job 4 months later. His last week of shifts, he told a colleague, he had stopped doing the 3 to 5 o'clock corridor patrol entirely. He sent a patrol report as usual. But he sat in the security office with all the cameras on and did not go into that wing again. What he had seen on the cameras during that last week, he said, was nothing. The cameras showed nothing. Which was, he said quietly, the part that frightened him most. Because there is a very specific nothing that you see on cameras when they are working and showing you an empty room. And there is a different kind of nothing. The kind that does not feel empty at all. Story 25. The Voice Under the Floorboards. Nicoletta Sarr found the voice in the same week she moved into the house, which was an old property in a countryside area of her country that she has not specified beyond that general description. The voice was not loud. It was not insistent. It was conversational. It spoke in a language she did not recognize, but in a tone she recognized immediately, the tone of someone telling a story. Low and even and unhurried, with a rhythm to it that rose and fell like spoken narrative. It came from under the floorboards in the kitchen. She could not identify exactly where, because the sound seemed to move slightly depending on where she stood. She would step closer to where she thought it was coming from, and it would seem to shift, recenter, continue from a different section of floor. She spoke to it. She felt foolish doing so, but she knelt on the kitchen floor and spoke to the voice underneath it and asked, in her own language, who was there. The voice did not stop. It did not respond to her directly. It continued its story, which she could not understand, in a pace that suggested it had been going on for a long time and would continue regardless of whether anyone was listening. She had a plumber come to check the pipes, thinking it might be water movement through the system. The plumber found nothing wrong with the pipes. He heard the voice. He left quickly, without charging her, which told her something about his assessment of the situation. She began recording the voice on her phone. She recorded hours of it over several months. She sent clips to linguists and historians and online translation communities. No one has identified the language. Several linguists have said it does not match any known language family, living or historical. One professor of linguistics replied to her request with a very long email detailing why the phoneme combinations in the recording were not consistent with any human language evolution they were aware of. He said it was fascinating and asked if he could study the recordings further, and then did not respond when she followed up. The voice is still there. She still lives in the house. She has grown accustomed to it in the way people grow accustomed to things that have been present long enough to become landscape. But she has noted one change over the 3 years she has lived with it. The voice, which she cannot understand, has changed in quality. It is no longer telling a story. She cannot say how she knows this, given that she cannot understand the words. But she knows it the way you know when someone's tone shifts even when you are not listening carefully. The voice is no longer telling a story. It is asking a question. The same question, in that same rhythmic, patient tone, over and over. And she is becoming very afraid of the day she understands what it is asking. Story 26. The Wedding Portrait. In a small antique shop in a coastal city, a framed wedding portrait has been for sale for 11 years. The shop's owner, a careful and well-organized woman named Hilda Caras, has marked it down repeatedly over those 11 years, from a starting price she will not now name to the current price of $1. She wants it out of the shop. She will practically give it away. But no one who looks at it for more than a moment will buy it. The portrait shows a couple in formal wedding dress from what appears to be the early 20th century. The man is seated. The woman stands behind him with one hand on his shoulder. This is standard. The composition is standard. The formal expressions of early photography are standard. Nothing in the image is unusual except for one thing that you notice only when you look at the photograph long enough, and that seeing it, you cannot unsee it. The woman's hand on the man's shoulder. The position of the fingers. They are not resting. They are not gentle. The fingers are curled, slightly, with a particular quality of a grip. The kind of grip that does not want to let go. And the man's expression, which at first reads as the stiff formality of early portrait photography, resolves, when you look at it longer, into something else. Something that is not formality. Something that is looking directly at the camera with an appeal that the formality of the era cannot quite conceal. Hilda knows the portrait's origin. She bought it from an estate. The estate was that of a man who had spent 70 years collecting items he believed were sites of what he called displaced distress. Objects that had absorbed something from the people who owned them. He had kept extensive records on each item, and the records for the wedding portrait were among the longest. He had researched the couple in the photograph. He had found newspaper records. He had found something that explained the woman's grip and the man's expression, and that had made him put the portrait in a box in a room he kept separate from the rest of his collection. Hilda has read the records. She will not share what they say. But she has said this: she does not put the portrait in the window because people walking past the shop should not have to see it. She keeps it at the back. And sometimes, when she arrives in the morning and turns on the lights, she finds it facing a different direction than she left it. Not moved. Not tilted. Rotated. As if it has been looking at something during the night. As if it wanted to see what else was in the room. Story 27. The House at the End of the Path. You may have heard stories like this one before, because stories like this one are told in almost every culture. There is always a house at the end of a path, at the edge of a village, separated from the rest of the community by distance or water or something else, something that the local people know about without articulating. And in every culture, the stories about that house share certain elements. It has been there longer than anyone remembers. No one goes near it without cause. And the cause, when someone finally has it, changes them. This specific house is in the mountains of a northern European country. It has been abandoned, by the official record, since the 1940s. The path that leads to it has not been maintained and is not on any hiking map. But it is still there, and people find it, because paths like that have a way of presenting themselves. A group of 3 friends found the path in summer 2 years ago. They followed it because they were curious and because it was daylight and because they were the kind of people who follow paths because they can. The house at the end of it was exactly as old houses look in the movies. Weathered. Settling. The windows intact but dark, the kind of dark that feels selective, as if the light is being refused rather than simply absent. They went inside. 2 of them. The third, Elspeth Nyberg, stayed outside because, she said later, she simply did not want to go in. Could not explain why. Just did not want to. Her friends went in and came out 10 minutes later and said there was nothing in the house except old furniture and some papers and a feeling like being watched by something that was not there. The papers were interesting enough that one of them, a man named Ruto, took photographs of them on his phone. When he reviewed the photographs later, he could see that the papers were covered in very small handwriting. He had the handwriting translated. It was a log. A daily log. Spanning 20 years, from the 1920s to the 1940s. Written by the house's last occupant, whose name was not given. The log described, in meticulous and increasingly distressed detail, the process of becoming aware of a presence in the house, and then the process of learning to live with it, and then the process of beginning to prefer it to other company, and finally the process of deciding not to leave. The last entry was dated in the winter of 1943 and said, "I have told the path not to show itself anymore. I want to be left alone now. I have everything I need here." Elspeth and Ruto have not returned to the area. But a hiker who found the path last year and followed it to the house reported something they shared on a hiking forum. The house appeared lived in. Not renovated. Not restored. Lived in. Recent food preparations in the kitchen. A fire that appeared to have been lit recently in the fireplace. Clothes on a hook by the door. And at the upstairs window, visible briefly before the hiker turned and left and did not look back, a figure. Standing. Watching them go. With the stillness of something that has been in one place for a very long time and has made its peace with everything. Story 28. The Echo That Answered Back. Cave exploration has its own community, cavers and spelunkers and amateur geologists, people who love the underground, the particular cool silence of deep spaces, the way the world above disappears when you descend into the earth. Most of them have stories of strange sensory experiences. Acoustics behave differently underground. Sounds carry in unexpected ways. The brain, deprived of its usual input, fills the silence with pattern. Most cavers know this and account for it. Petra Van Eck, an experienced caver with 15 years of exploration documented, accounts for it. She keeps a level head. She does not startle. She has spent hundreds of hours underground in isolated spaces and has a reliable framework for distinguishing the strange but explicable from the strange and not explicable. When she says something could not be explained, it is worth paying attention to. She was exploring an unmapped section of a cave system in Central Europe, alone, which she acknowledges was inadvisable and did regardless. She had descended to a chamber perhaps 200 meters below the surface, large enough that her headlamp did not reach the far walls. She was taking measurements and making notes. Standard work. She was speaking her notes aloud and recording them on a device, a habit that keeps her focused and creates an automatic log. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. She had heard something. She played back her recording later and could hear exactly where she stopped and exactly what she had heard. An echo. Except the echo was not a repetition of what she had just said. It was a continuation. She had stopped her sentence at a particular word, and the echo, from the far wall or walls, had completed the sentence correctly, in a voice that was similar to hers but not identical. She tested it. She said a word she had not planned to say, chosen randomly. Something she had not said before in that chamber, something the cave's acoustics could not have stored and replayed from earlier in the session. The echo completed the word into a sentence that answered her. A sentence that was, she said, contextually relevant to what she was doing. As if something in the cave was listening and had been listening and was ready, after sufficient time, to participate in the conversation. She left the cave. She has not returned to that section. She has published her recording through private channels to other cavers and researchers. She has not shared it publicly because she does not know what to say about it that does not sound like something she is not willing to sound like. But she has said this in private correspondence. The echo knew more than she had said aloud. It knew things she had thought. And it completed her sentences not in her words, but in words that were more accurate than the ones she had been planning to use. Story 29. The Sound Before the Knock. Here is a thing that researchers of unexplained phenomena have noted, not as a conclusion but as an observation consistent enough to be interesting. In a significant number of accounts of unexplained knocking, the sound that precedes the knock is more disturbing than the knock itself. A silence, specifically. Not the ambient silence of a quiet room, but a removal of ambient sound, as if someone has reached into the space and taken the air's normal texture away, leaving something that feels pressurized, concentrated, aware. People describe it as the feeling of being underwater suddenly, or the feeling of altitude change, or the feeling right before a speaker is switched on, the expectant charged quality of a system primed to produce sound. They describe it, and then they describe the knock following it as almost a relief, because at least the knock is a sound and sounds can be investigated and explained. This observation is relevant because of the following account, sent anonymously to a researcher of unexplained phenomena by someone who identified themselves only as a former emergency dispatcher. The dispatcher described receiving a call on a quiet night from a woman who said there was someone knocking on her door. Standard call. The dispatcher began the standard protocol, asking for location, asking whether the caller could see who was at the door. The caller said she could not see who was at the door because the knock was not coming from the front door. It was coming from the inside of her closet. She said she was in her bedroom with the lights on, and she could hear knocking from inside her closet, and before it started there had been a silence that she was trying to describe and struggling with, eventually saying it felt like someone held their hand over both my ears at the same time and then let go just before the knocking started. The dispatcher stayed on the line. Standard procedure when a caller is frightened and waiting for an officer. The woman stayed on the line and continued talking, describing the knocking, which she said was slow and patient. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, and then she stopped mid-sentence. Not frightened. Mid-sentence, as if distracted. And then the line went quiet. The dispatcher could hear, through the still open call, the ambient sound of the woman's house. Heating system. Distant traffic. The small sounds of a lived-in space. And then the silence. The dispatcher could hear, through the phone, the exact silence the woman had described. The pressure of it. The removal. And then the dispatcher heard, once, slow and deliberate and very close to the woman's phone, 3 knocks. And then the call disconnected. The officer who responded to the address found the house unlocked and empty. The closet was open. It contained ordinary clothing. Nothing inside. Nothing on the floor. The woman has never been found. The dispatcher, who had 20 years of experience and had heard many frightening things on the line, resigned within the month. They said in their resignation letter that they were leaving because of something they had been unable to stop thinking about since that call. Not the silence, and not the knocking. What they could not stop thinking about was the moment of quiet between the woman stopping mid-sentence and the silence arriving. In that moment, they had heard something. very briefly, from a direction they could not identify. A sound they described as someone softly, quietly, with enormous patience, saying, "H." Story 30. The Last Door. There is a theory, unverified and unverifiable by conventional means, that speaks to the one question underneath all of these stories, underneath every unexplained sound and vanished person and figure in the fog and voice under the floor. The question is not what are these things. The question is why here? Why these places? Why these people? Why does something choose a specific wall to knock from, a specific lake to stand in, a specific house to grow within? Why do these encounters happen to the people they happen to and not to others? Why does the fog rise in that particular crossing and not the one 3 miles east? The theory, which has been proposed independently by researchers in folklore, in psychology, in certain branches of physics that concern themselves with consciousness, is this. There are places in the world where the barrier between what we experience and what exists beyond our experience is thin. Not broken. Thin. Like the skin of something very old that has been in the same place for a very long time and has worn down in spots. And there are people who, for reasons perhaps genetic or perhaps experiential or perhaps entirely random, are more sensitive to those thin places. More visible to whatever is on the other side. These people do not seek out the experiences. The experiences find them. The knocking starts. The photographs appear. The voice comes through the monitor. Not because these people went looking, but because something looked at them through the thin place and found them interesting enough to reach toward. And here is the part of the theory that tends to quiet a room when it is spoken aloud. If this is true, then the experiences in these stories are not random events. They are communications. They are the equivalent of something pressing its face to a window and breathing on the glass. Not to harm. Not necessarily, but to be known, to be acknowledged, to close even slightly the distance between what is here and what is there. Which means the question you should perhaps be sitting with right now is not what is on the other side of the thin place. The question is, what does it mean that it has chosen to reach toward you? What does it mean that you are drawn to these stories in the dark? What does it mean that you have listened all the way to the end? Something draws certain people to certain places, to certain sounds, to certain questions that do not have answers. Something makes people listen. Think about where you are right now. The house around you. The walls. The darkness outside the windows. The sounds you are used to and the sounds you are not. Think about the places in this world where the barrier is thin. Think about the possibility that you are near one of them. That you have, perhaps, always been near one of them. That the slight unease you have felt reading these stories is not imagination. That it is recognition. Because here is the last thing, the thing these 30 stories have been building toward, the thing that connects every knocking wall and every figure in the water and every voice beneath the floor and every photograph that was not taken. They are not separate events. They are not coincidences gathered for an evening's entertainment. Look at what they share. The patience. The specific patience of something that has time in quantities we cannot comprehend. The way they wait. The way they learn your patterns before they move. The way they prefer not to be seen directly, preferring the corner of the eye, the reflection, the sound from the other room. The way they knock before they enter. Every story tonight was a knock. Every one. And you have been listening. So ask yourself the one question left, the only one that matters as midnight settles in around you and the world outside goes very quiet. If all of this has been a knock at the door, and if you have been listening long enough to hear all 30 of them, then what does it mean that you have been listening so patiently, so completely, so quietly in the dark, in exactly the way that something on the other side would listen? What does it mean that you are still here? What does it mean that you have not moved? What does it mean that, just now, you held your breath? Sleep well. Stay curious. Keep your doors locked. And remember that the 31st story is the one that starts when you close your eyes. It has already begun.